Jeannette, you're a policy analyst and you speak to investors. So what are you telling them about what a partial shutdown looks like for the U.S. government in terms of market and economic implications?
So in general, historically, when we look at the government shutdowns, they don't have a very large impact on the U.S. economy or on financial markets. And generally, obviously, it's usually a full government shutdown. This time we have 75% of the government that is funded. Only 25% is going to be impacted by this shutdown, so that it has even a smaller impact. But as I think as the news today, you kind of see these secondary effects that are going to have a bigger impact, and that's more what we're concerned and we think investors are concerned about. So there's things like the fact. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was going to say, you've got all sorts of stuff, whether it's Fed stuff. I mean, Mattis, we haven't even discussed the fallout from the defense secretary resigning in protest, really, and he'll leave in February. But that can only add to perhaps some of the market jitters that have already existed.
Exactly. And so you're going to have, bad headlines maybe going into the holiday season, what with the government shutdown and with just the stock market being down in general. Then you kind of saw these other effects with, there's this budget fight. It showed that Trump is now showing some unpredictability. He had a budget deal on Wednesday. They were going to fund the government, and then they moved back on some conservative pressure. And so then that kind of like foretells into the future, how is that going to play into other debates that they might be having in other negotiations. And then on top of that, then you saw culminating effects, right? So you had the Syria announcement to pull out the troops there, and then you see Secretary Mattis resign on that, and that actually would be probably bigger news overall than just a government shutdown at this point.
When the market was going straight up, basically, after the election, ahead of the tax cuts and on the deregulation and largely on the Trump agenda, we called it the Trump trades. And it really was. I mean, there was so much optimism out there. How much of this sharp slide, 20% from the NASDAQ, 16% off the highs for the S&P, has to do with the president?
Well, I think there's obviously some other factors coming into play. Obviously, the Fed has a very big role, but I think that the investors are kind of extrapolating a little bit to what's going to happen next year. So you're going to have divided government, so it's not going to be as easy for the Trump administration to get some of its policies through. And so you're going to see some obstruction maybe on like deregulation and things like that. But then you also have, how are things like trade going to play out? How are things like the debt ceiling going to play out? Sequestration. So there's those kind of fights that I think people are starting to get a little bit worried about, and how those actually play out coming up in the next year. And that's why that's also kind of putting some impact as well on the market. But it's not obviously just about Trump.
You expect anything to get done next year? I mean, after the scene in the Oval with the president, the vice president, and the Democratic leadership, now this going into the end of the year, and we want to talk about infrastructure and the hopes for anything to get done. What are your hopes?
Well, so I mean, it's interesting. Sometimes government shutdowns are a good thing because it kind of flushes some of this out of the system. I don't necessarily know if that's going to be true in this case. We'll see how this kind of comes to a conclusion first before we move forward on that. But there's still opportunities for things to actually get done. Doesn't mean you're not going to see some acrimony and some, fighting back and forth on both sides. But there is still an option to do a couple things on infrastructure. They do have to get a budget deal. Sequestration comes in on October 1st. Both parties are going to have to come together and fill that gap, and they probably will, because we've never had sequestration come into effect. There's going to be the debt ceiling fight, so they're going to have to come to an agreement on that. And there's little things that you could actually see, like infrastructure, maybe something on drug prices or things like that, that could come out of this. Doesn't mean that always just when we fight, we can't ever get anything done, even though it might seem harder and there might be a lot of political noise that comes with it.